Hey everyone, how we doing? Perfect. We're gonna give just about 60 seconds or so that everyone can join into the meeting. Okay, we still see participants flowing in. Thank you, welcome for coming. Okay, we can go ahead and get started, I think. We don't want to tally too much. So thank you everyone for coming to the shift. This is session 12, and today we're going to be doing a chat on deforestation and managing progress on deforestation goals. So I'm going to start by just giving the simple synopsis, and then from there, we're going to go into doing introductions, and then we'll begin our panel discussion. From there, we would love to get Q&A from the audience, and we'll have a wrap up. In total, we're expecting this to take about the full hour, maybe a little less. We'll see where we go. Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone. Again, I'm going to give that synopsis for what we're doing for today. So for this specific seminar, we are looking at managing progress and deforestation goals. Simply setting deforestation commitments isn't enough. You must ask yourself how your organization is tracking progress and what is being done to understand its supply chain better, to ensure the products it sells aren't associated with deforestation. This is especially true with that new EU legislation that's coming, or that is now here, which means that more than ever, it is essential for your organization to have renewed focus on due diligence and transparency in its supply chain. So today, again, we're going to be doing mainly discussions around how to manage progress towards deforestation goals amidst changing legislation, and how you can tailor your approach to fit your organization and feel confident in the products that you are selling. My name is Meredith Kiyomura, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. We have a number of amazing participants that are here with us today. I'm going to go do a bit of a round robin where each one can introduce themselves. I'll say their name first, and then we'll begin the panel discussion. So we'll start off with Jonathan Reinbold. He is the Sustainability Director for Thomas Foods. Jonathan, would you like to give an introduction?
Sure. I've been in the food and beverage space in sustainability roles for about 12 or 13 years, primarily in livestock-based food and beverages.
Thank you so much. Okay. Next, we'll go to Lisa Zawak. I hope I'm saying your last name right. Head of Sustainability at Kroger. Would you like to give some?
Unfortunately, Lisa is sick, and
oh no,
the whole family's sick, so she had to cancel last minute. So
oh goodness, I am so sorry I missed that. Well, we are thinking of Lisa. We will keep her in our prayers then. Then Jamie, since you're here, how would we go with you?
Great. Yeah, I'm Jamie Barcy-Mantov. I'm one of the co-founders and the Chief Strategy Officer here at SupplyShift, and have been helping our customers on deforestation issues from the very beginning.
Thank you so much. Okay, and then we'll go with our last one, Cheryl Baldwin. She's the VP of Sustainability and Consulting at Pure Strategies. Cheryl.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here. Yes, I do sustainability consulting, mostly with brands and retailers to help advance their environmental and social progress across their business and supply chains.
All right, thank you so much, Cheryl. Love to hear from you. Okay, so now that we've done our introductions, again, we're going to get into this panel discussion. As mentioned before, we're looking at deforestation goals and progress. So Jonathan, I've actually had the pleasure of working with Thomas Foods, and as he mentioned, they're generally looking at livestock agriculture and in that sort of realm. And one of the things that Jonathan has done is he's actually gone to Nicaragua for Thomas Foods in order to look into their deforestation commitments. So he's actually had a very hands-on approach in understanding their supply chain. And he traveled there actually last year to do one-on-ones with his suppliers. So Jonathan, I would love for you to just sort of maybe just share a little bit about what that experience was like, what you learned, and maybe some things that you didn't expect, and how that was helping you to refine your next steps.
Sure. Um, so Thomas Foods, we're a meat processor. We've been in business for 35 years, primarily importing from Australia and New Zealand lamb. Our business has grown. We have been sourcing other proteins globally, especially from South and Central America. With our Australian supply, we have a really close relationship with the ranchers there, as our parent company is more vertically integrated. They're directly procuring animals, slaughtering, and doing primary processing. Whereas the rest of our supply chain, especially South and Central America, we're working with brokers sometimes, other suppliers that we don't have quite the length of relationship with. So the business has been procuring from Nicaragua for a number of years. When we were called out in a news article related to land conflicts in Nicaragua. And in this story, there was a connection made between the export beef industry and indigenous communities there. So the business, Thomas Foods USA, as soon as this was brought up, we immediately stopped sourcing from there, but we were still concerned that the story wasn't complete. And I was hired about a year later. After that, we still weren't sourcing from there, but our business was still growing. We had a need to identify additional supply, and we had good relationships with the suppliers in Nicaragua. So, my task was to find out whether we should re-engage with Nicaragua or fully move away from that region because of these conflicts. There's a lot you can learn, through Google and phone calls and over the computer, but really being on the ground is essential to see what's actually happening, understand the local context. So we did, started with SupplyShift and having a supplier survey, but ultimately we had to be there in person. So I met with the Export Council for the Nicaraguan Beef Chamber, visited the slaughterhouses, the feedlots, the ranchers that are raising the animals before they go to feedlots. And it was, extremely enlightening. There's a lot of similarities with the US beef sector, but also plenty of differences. And I went into that experience kind of expecting the worst. The stories of land conflicts are true. And I was expecting to come back home and tell the business that we should not have a relationship there. But I saw firsthand that, exactly the opposite was the case, that these throughout the whole beef industry there, the government has a very robust livestock traceability program, one that I would say is rivaled only by Australia's, which is, head and shoulders above the rest globally, but better than I've seen anywhere else in the world, save for Australia. So every animal movement from their birth on farm through to a grazing operation, to a feedlot, to slaughter is all tracked. Any animal that's being moved without prior approval is sequestered, and that animal doesn't enter the export supply chain. So ultimately, being on the ground, the primary takeaways were that there are two separate beef industries there. There is the one in sensitive ecological zones where land conflicts with indigenous communities do occur, but that's a hyper-localized system. Animals that are raised there are consumed within those communities, and animals that get into the export supply chain are completely separate. They're tracked. And we can be confident that those animals were not involved or raised on any illegally deforested land or associated with any land conflicts. And secondly, something that I didn't expect either was that when we ask suppliers to do the right thing from our perspective, to plant trees, to do reforestation, to have positive policies with their workers, et cetera. I went into it expecting to have to convince suppliers to do these things that we know our customers and consumers want. And what I was faced with was that these type of things we're asking for have been in place for decades in some instances. And that, we in America don't necessarily get to claim that superiority in terms of the environmental stewardship and social policies that maybe we tend to think we have. And I ended up asking questions about why are you doing this? Why have you been reforesting this land for the last 10 years when you don't have to? And their response was why are you asking that? Of course, this is what we're doing. We're improving this operation. So yeah, I came away completely confident that having a relationship with those suppliers was the right thing for our business. And yeah, so we are reinitiating those relationships and sourcing from there. And I never would have gained that perspective if I hadn't physically been there.
That is such a compelling story. Thank you so much for sharing. So excited to hear just everything that you learned while you were there. One thing that I would like to just point out to the whole entire group is that if you do have questions for Jonathan or for any of our other panelists today, feel free to put them into the Q&A. Again, we also will have an opportunity for you to be able to raise your hand at some point so that you can ask questions as well. So, there are those opportunities to do this during this time, but feel free to add in questions into the Q&A chat as we go along. So thank you again, Jonathan, for giving us those real life stories. And I'm sure that if you want to hear more about Nicaragua and the things that he learned, and maybe some of the best places to go get food, I'm sure that Jonathan will more than be happy to share all that information with you. We're going to move on to Cheryl. So Cheryl, with Pure Strategies, I know that you work with brands and retailers to build better sustainable sourcing practices. Can you share your work with brands, why you see brands working on deforestation, and why it's important to do so, especially in today's climate and how things are changing, and maybe some common steps that you see people taking?
Yeah, happy to. And so it's kind of stepping back a bit from where Jonathan was diving in, because a lot of the companies we're working with do need a little bit more information to understand why they would take on getting more information about their supply chain, and in particular addressing deforestation risks in their supply chain. So sometimes it's helping educate the companies that we're working with, just to remind them the connection that, well, first, deforestation is still happening. Sometimes people think that it's a problem that's been addressed, but it is still an issue, and it is still happening in places where there are some of the most ecologically important places in forests. So there is a need to still be paying attention to this issue. And it's connected to an area that a lot of companies already have commitments around in terms of climate. When you look at ag and forestry, half of the emissions are coming from deforestation and land conversion. So it's an important area that connects to other aspects of a company's work. And it reaches beyond emissions too. Things like water, livelihoods, as Jonathan connected to. So it's a cross-cutting issue. And what we find is that not all companies know very much about where they're getting some of the materials. And when you're talking about especially high risk materials where there's good chance or a potential that there's deforestation connected to a material. It's even more important to get that visibility about where materials come from. But I'd say it's kind of surprising probably to people when they start looking at, fiber or cocoa or some materials that they think, well, we should know enough about this. We want to have it be recycled content. But then when they start asking questions about, from their procurement teams, then the procurement teams asking suppliers, they're not getting the answers that they would have expected. So there is a need to do this additional work in understanding more about the supply chain. So that's like one part of it, is there's kind of like a bit of knowledge needed. But there's also on the other side, a lot of growing pressure and demand happening outside of companies to be doing more. You mentioned at the outset, Meredith, around the EU deforestation free regulation and that requirement for due diligence to make sure high risk commodities are coming from deforested land, and also transparency around that. So that's one piece, but there's also other aspects, such as the new global biodiversity framework that was finalized last year. That is, for the first time, has targets at a global level around biodiversity and making sure that companies, so there's a target specifically looking at companies and making sure that they're assessing and disclosing their impacts and dependencies on nature, where forest deforestation is clearly a big topic. And there's other initiatives that are growing as well. There's a lot of movement around disclosure. So the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI, as well as the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, or TNFD. Those are two disclosure frameworks that are also encouraging more information from companies to be shared around biodiversity and nature, and in particular, this big issue around deforestation. All of these and others, like the Science-Based Target Initiative, the Science-Based Target Network, I could go on with a lot of these different organizations, but what it comes down to is they're all expecting companies to be understanding or assessing deforestation, nature risk in their supply chain, making a commitment to deforestation and conversion-free supplies, in particular with high-risk commodities, and we can cover what those are later, and then taking the appropriate action that, like Jonathan was describing, to be sure that in fact there isn't deforestation and conversion happening, and then sharing that progress through disclosures. So those are like the main things that all these different frameworks and regulations and voluntary programs are expecting.
My computer was going wild. I was like trying to unmute myself. Wow, that was so much good information. And yeah, I think what's really exciting about seeing what Jonathan was sharing, what Cheryl was sharing, is that you get to see it from two different perspectives. You get to see it from the perspective of a retailer trying to do this in boots on ground, and then Cheryl, who's been working with a lot of our different groups and working with those retailers and being able to give some areas to focus on and how to get into the area that Jonathan's group is going into. So absolutely, there are so many different things that we're thinking about as far as that new legislation that's coming about. I do want to actually ask a question about that in one of our next talking points, but before we move into talking more about legislation, and I do see a couple of questions in the chat, which we will absolutely get to, I do want to give an opportunity for Jamie to also chat a little bit as well and share some of his knowledge. So Jamie, as the co-founder and chief strategy officer at SupplyShift, you connect with a number of brands across industries. What are some of the common needs and focuses that you're seeing among brands today in our current landscape?
Right, you know, it's this topic is so near and dear to my heart. I'll just step back a little bit. Once long ago, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Panama, and I was working in communities where deforestation was happening and trying to figure out ways for people to have sustainable livelihoods in those landscapes. My PhD work was on deforestation in Mexico and sustainable forestry as a mechanism to reduce impacts on forests. And from that kind of really on the ground, right there, the complexities of what happens with deforestation, and really it's, there's this tendency to say, deforestation is bad. Well, it is bad, obviously, but there's a lot of complex needs and livelihoods and poverty that happens in those zones. So it's really hard to just point a finger, right? And there's so much local complexity. And then bring that all the way to the very end of the spectrum to like a retailer who has very little understanding of what their tier 1 suppliers are doing, and where to start, right? When there's laws, when there's pressure from investors, when there's commitments to make, how do you go from all the way over here to all the way over there? And is it even possible? I think Jonathan's perspective is amazing, right? Because Thomas Foods, I mean, they're buying directly from slaughterhouses, right? So they kind of know generally where things come from, and how you take that deeper dive. I think it's an amazing example of that. And I'm disappointed that Lisa couldn't make it. Unfortunately, when someone's under the weather, you don't really want to join the panels. But I think, having one step removed from where Thomas Food is, right? So they're, I'm sure Kroger buys from, I don't know if they actually buy from Thomas Foods or not, but they probably buy from lots of companies who sell them beef products, and palm oil products, and paper products, and soy-based products, right? So the 4 main deforestation commodities, and how do you get a handle on this, right? How do you start? So I think that's kind of where we've seen companies, early days, right? There was deforestation commitments that companies made that came due in 2020, right? A lot of companies set deforestation commitments in 2015. It was kind of the first wave. I don't think any of those companies met their commitments, right? Like Cheryl said, deforestation is still happening, right? And I think companies made a lot of progress. They tried a lot of different things, and I think what we learned from that is, especially at SupplyShift, how do we consolidate that, and how do we make some really distinct steps for companies to take, starting from, I don't know anything. I haven't even asked my suppliers anything about where things come from, right? So that's I think where a lot of companies are at, is like, okay, how do I start by just asking my suppliers, what countries do you source from for each commodity? And are you doing the things that we'd expect you to do to have a responsible sourcing mechanism in place, right? Do you include things in your contract? Do you have a diligence process? Simple things, right? Not the end, right? It's not the end of the story. And Jonathan's, we could even dig in with Jonathan. I'm curious to ask you this, Jonathan, about those 2 economies of beef in Nicaragua. And it's great that Thomas Foods can buy from the clean one, but does that just support the not so clean one continuing? Or, how do these things interact with each other? I mean, the complexity is endless, right? But having those stages to move through. And I think that the upcoming legislation in the EU is really pushing companies to go beyond that. It's really not enough to take that first step. It's like, take that first step, and then how do you dive deeper? How do you get some assurance? How do you map beyond that? And then how do you shift supply to then say, wow, there's really too much risk over there, and I shouldn't be buying from there. And do you shift supply, or do you work with your suppliers? Do you check up on your suppliers? And then each commodity supply chain looks a little bit different, right? And there's challenges with transparency in each of those. People think they have transparency in their palm oil supply chains, but a lot of it's mass balance. So you kind of got some certificates over here, but it all, unless it's identity preserved palm oil, it's all going in the same ship, right? So what goes in, what comes out, so there's a lot going on in there. And I think from our perspective, the key thing is giving companies a good base of information to start, and not overwhelming their suppliers, and having a way to understand where the risk is, and then being able to dive deeper with a custom assessment, looking multi-tier, and lots of things to then take the next steps on the journey.
Thank you, Jamie. That was so great. So as you can see, we have all these different perspectives, and we're able to see how you can maybe begin your deforestation or goals, as far as like getting into those commitments and understanding them, or maybe helping to refine them as well. With the idea of refining, can any of you maybe share what you know about the deforestation legislation that's coming out of Europe, and what companies should be getting prepared for? And what is the status of the new law as well? Because I think that that's an ever fluctuating bit that's happening here. So if anyone can share their ideas on that and what they know, that would be great.
I can start maybe, and others can jump in. Right now, the law was approved by the EU Parliament, and it's being approved by the member states right now. And they expect that to be kind of late spring is when there would be, then all the states will have approved it, and then it would come back to the EU Parliament. And I think they're expecting about a 12 to 18 month implementation timeline for then companies being required to then report and comply with the law. So there's still some time, which is good. On the other hand, it's definitely ratcheting up things a lot. First of all, it's basically taking the EU timber regulation, expanding it to cover palm, soy, beef, cocoa, maybe one or two other commodities. I can't remember right now which ones, but expanding the commodities and also expanding the requirements for traceability and diligence. So it's a little bit similar to the German human rights law, where it's really spelling out stages of diligence that companies have to move through, which definitely ratchets it up from the EU timber regulation. So I participated in a roundtable hosted by the International Trade Center a few months ago, where it's kind of meant to kind of bring out issues and ideas to help really formulate the law and make it more specific. What I came away with from that is that there's still a ways to go. The requirements are so strict that they seem unattainable as far as traceability. Yet those first stages of diligence are really obvious. So I think that there's still a ways to go, but it's definitely something coming down the lane. I don't know if Cheryl or Jonathan have more to add about that.
Just a couple quick things that you mentioned, a few of the big crops that people think of. There's a couple other smaller ones or ones that maybe are unique to this. So rubber was added most recently, and I think in the last iteration. I don't know if you mentioned coffee as well. So there's kind of a broader, like, high risk list of materials to be aware of. The other interesting thing is that it's not just for companies based in the EU. It would apply to products sold in the EU. So it's also kind of a broad coverage, and it's includes small and medium-sized enterprises, which again, just it's a pretty broad scope in terms of the number and types of companies that would be expected to be compliant with this. For small and medium-sized enterprises, they have a longer time period to comply with the regulations, but still, it's a pretty broad, sweeping approach.
I'll just add anecdotally, we have like a sister company, Thomas Foods Europe, whom I interact with, their head of sustainability. And recently he's been expressing the need to know about, especially soy sourcing from that's going into their supply chain. They source beef globally as well, and they are increasingly aware of the need for traceability for those at-risk commodities, especially due to grocery retailers' pressure. So it's being felt for real.
That's helpful to hear that anecdotal as well. Yeah, and I mean, the timeline does, even for a small team, sounds like it's going to be rather aggressive. So, hopefully we're, as far as compliance goes, everyone can figure out their niche and be able to move forward with it. So I am seeing a couple of messages within the chat as far as questions, and then also some Q&A questions. So I do want to give an opportunity for those as well. Thank you, everyone, for sharing all of your information. We're going to move into the question part. So as mentioned before, you can put in your questions in the Q&A. You can also opt to raise your hand, and then from there, we will unmute you so that you can go ahead and ask questions if you'd like to that way. The first one that I see is actually in our chat and not in the Q&A. I think this might have been during when Cheryl was speaking. And so I'm not sure if this is one for Cheryl in specific, but maybe we can just ask this broadly and then everyone can sort of answer to it. This specific question is asking, do you mean procurement teams aren't getting the answers from suppliers that they expect? Are the answers more concerning or unclear, where suppliers know less than the procurement teams expect? I think that might have been towards Cheryl because it looks like it popped in during that time. But if anyone has any thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I can start. And it's a combination, but it's often that suppliers aren't able to answer the questions because it may be the first time they've been asked it, or they don't have enough information and they need to do some digging themselves. So that's kind of a more common scenario than them saying, oh, it's deforested and we can't comply. It's more typically that they need to do some homework on their end to get the answers.
Yeah, I mean, a good example of that, I know Meredith has been deep into this stuff in the world of paper supply chains. If you buy paper from a converter, the converter buys it from a mill. The mill might buy it from a pulp mill who gets it from a forest. And so that converter might not know where the actual timber comes from, right? So what do you do in that case? Do you then say, hey, well, that's a requirement of doing business. You've got to disclose that stuff. You got to go figure it out. Or do you ask them, or do you map that supply chain yourself, right? You say, hey, okay, well then tell me where you get it from, and I'll ask them where they get it from, and ask them where they get it from until I identify the source. We see companies take both approaches. I think there's pros and cons to both, as you know, requiring your tier one to provide you transparency or getting the transparency yourself. I think the EU law is pushing more towards you having the transparency. Yeah, I think that's kind of what that question was getting at, is that, like Cheryl said, suppliers often don't know, and this is kind of the first step, is you got to push them to know if they don't know. Jonathan, curious about when you're talking with you know, your suppliers in Nicaragua, it sounds like they do know where their cows come from within the country.
Yeah, there's it's all part of a government system or agency. Right now, when I was there, say 6 months ago, about 70% of the whole traceability program was digitized. There is still, you know, paper and pen tracking. The whole of Nicaragua is not, electricity is not equitably distributed. So there's folks that, you know, computers are not able to be used on their ranches. So pen and paper is still used a lot. But within the next year or so, the objective is for the whole country's system to be digitized, app-based. So any farmer, rancher can, you know, there's a fairly straightforward form. You know, each animal has a code associated with it. And if a farmer Joe is selling his cattle down the street, he would indicate which cattle numbers are going to be sold, a specific location they're coming from, and to, and then they're transferred. Before they're physically transferred, that the request is approved, and then the animals are moved. So I've met with the leader of the agency, and he showed me as transfers were coming into their system, like, okay, this farmer just moved 20 cattle to this auction. So yeah, it's very impressive. It takes a long time to get those systems up. I'll say that. They've been working on it, I think, for 15 to 20 years now. And probably the first 10 to 12, they didn't make a lot of progress. But as pressure has come from buyers, you know, they have made significant strides just in the period of time that I had been doing my research to when I was actually on the ground. Real significant strides had been made from, you know, a paper-based system that, from my perception, could be manipulated to one that is pretty clear in the traceability and its accuracy.
I guess beef has that advantage that the cow was born, cow can be tagged, and then you've got that digitized until it goes to the slaughterhouse, whereas other commodities don't quite work like that. And so it's more complicated when things get mixed in different parts of the supply chain. You can't tag every soybean.
If we could, that'd be great. I think that Jonathan brought up a really great point, though, when discussing is the idea that parts of the country are not completely, don't have the access to specific things like internet and like those kind of equities that are not, it's not equitable there, right? So those are things to think about as well when you're thinking about these processes, is how you can maybe help to support your suppliers to be able to have those access to those things that they need in order to help you. So always asking questions, you know, why is it that you weren't able to offer me this specific information? It might be because they just don't have the resources, and how could you help them to get those resources? I do want to move into a next question that I see as well. So this one is, I think, a great one to ask. It's social impacts are typically difficult to measure. Are there any good systems in existence that help companies to develop good monitoring practice with their suppliers, e.g. around livelihoods or gender outcomes? And this one's for anyone.
I'll go. So the resources to help companies, I don't know that explicitly. I'll share our experience. Perhaps there is one of the, I don't know, standard assessments or something from SupplyShift focused on that. But from the Thomas Foods perspective, while I acknowledge that, you know, our beef supply is not coming from the conflict zones, which in terms of scale, so Nicaragua is roughly the size of New York State. Around a third of it, the eastern third on the Atlantic or the Caribbean, is a protected area. It is legally owned by many indigenous groups collectively, and it is not, the ownership can't be transferred. So lack of jobs, lack of an economy within many of those areas resulted in a lot of land conflicts, either because in some cases indigenous locals sell the rights to land to outsiders that don't know any better, or outsiders come in and have squatted and essentially just taken management of land. You know, these conflicts have been real. They have resulted in violence, and in some circumstances, even deaths of indigenous individuals. The beef industry, the mining industry, and the timber industry are all these extractive industries that have had some role in these conflicts. And they all have a negative impact on the climate because of deforestation. So while we can look at that and say, I'm glad we're not a part of that, the reality is it's still occurring. It's still happening in this, you know, small country where these suppliers that we now are developing relationships are operating. So the Export Council, Beef Export Council of Nicaragua, has engaged with an indigenous university. It's called the Bluefields Indian and Caribbean University, that cater to indigenous communities. And they're teaching them, well, they have hired teachers to help them on reforestation projects. And they asked us to support that, and we have. So we're contributing financially to that, but a stipulation for us was that at least as many women as men were participants. When I personally use the drawdown as a primary resource for myself at looking at climate solutions, and education of women is one of the most impactful climate mitigation activities that can occur. So that was a requirement of our support for that education and reforestation project. And, you know, progress is going well thus far. It's been a series of, you know, online lectures to this point, and the teachers are going to be in country with the students in, you know, I think next month, and actually reforesting some previously deforested land. So yeah, that gender equity was essential for Thomas Foods to support that. That wasn't from, you know, any specific monitoring or any other program, but just knowing that from drawdown. It's a great book. So I guess that's a cheap, valuable resource that you can look at if you're not familiar with it.
I'll just add to that I think initially when we were helping customers assess supply chains for deforestation, it was really focused on the forest and deforestation and the environmental side of it. And more questions are being included around land rights, free, prior, and informed consent. I think one of our standard palm oil assessments has that baked into it. So I think just like Jonathan said, the social side is really wrapped up in the deforestation itself. And so specifically within the deforestation topic, the social issues are becoming almost a necessary part of understanding the issue. And then obviously outside of that, SupplyShift has great assessments on human rights. We're looking at adding one on gender. So if that person who put that question there about gender is interested, we're looking to partner with ICRW to load a gender assessment that they have, but that's really outside of the topic of deforestation and really just gender more holistically.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. We have another question in the chat as well. Visibility is a laudable goal, but high-risk tropical commodities inherently lead to traced and untraced deforestation. What is the appetite for adoption and investment in non-agriculture biotech solutions like cellular ag and precision fermentation?
Jonathan, you guys gonna replace everything with Beyond Burgers or?
So I would say it's unlikely, but you never know. So Thomas Foods USA has done for a lot of our are likely not familiar with the Thomas Foods brand. Most of the product that we process and pack is then labeled in retail grocery chains like house brand. So you're not going to necessarily see our name too often in the stores, but we have partnered with and developed like a, was referred to as a 50-50, half beef, half plant-based protein. I forget the retailer that was with, but ultimately it didn't sell very well. So we're not doing that any longer. The parent, TFI Australia, is looking at other plant-based and has made a significant investment in plant-based proteins. So you can Google them, and I'm sure you'll find that rather easily. That's not currently in production, but should be coming in the next probably 18 to 24 months. That's not cellular or precision fermentation though. And we're not currently involved in those type of activities, but we're certainly tracking them. While we deal in meat, we consider ourselves a protein company. So when there are products that are viable and desired from, at both ends of the supply chain, we're not developing the expertise in those manufacturing practices, but we certainly have, other parts of the supply chain that can benefit those type of products. So, we carry other people's or other brands' products on our trucks, use our logistics companies, and we help our customers have a complete protein offering. So if that means they're looking for not just lamb, but also beef, or also pork or poultry, or plant-based or precision fermentation, those are things that we're more than willing to do. But we're not currently involved in the cellular and precision space.
And I think overall there's a huge potential for those things, but the cost, and then are they really one-for-one replacements for the things that people are used to putting in their mouths? I think there's definitely room for that, right? As much you can grow things not in tropical forested landscapes, then that's great. Although you might think that people are going to want to grow other things there if they can't grow the things that, if we replace a certain commodity with something that we can grow in a lab, those landscapes are still going to be used, right? People live there, they need to make money. So I think there's still underlying social and environmental problems to solve no matter what.
I'll just maybe expand it a little bit to think about, the concept at a higher level to, is it about replacing the commodities with something else? And this question came up with palm oil early on. Should companies just move away from palm oil? And, in some cases that makes sense, but not in every case. And it does take looking at multiple considerations to be sure that you're not overlooking or what we call shifting the burden to another place. For example, if you use a different vegetable or plant-based oil, it may take a lot more land, require a lot more fertilizer, organic or non-organic, and have, as a result, a lot more emissions and land degradation as a result. So, it's kind of a balance. You do need to step back and think about kind of that bigger picture and be sure that there's not any shifting of burdens.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. We also see a note from one of our attendees that says, as far as the EU laws that are coming out, that it's also worth to mention that the law will actually punish companies not complying. Failure to comply could result in fines of up to 4% of a company's turnover, confiscation of goods and revenues, among other measure prohibition to trade. Ooh, apparently can't say that word today. The next, I do have a question. What systems can be used to verify traceability of these supply chains for the commodities covered by the scope of the EU regulations?
I think the national ear tag systems that some but not all countries have are probably the best thing that's out there. Verifying traceability is really hard, unfortunately. If you already know your supply chain, then there are great tools, maybe blockchain style, for kind of following that material from its source to where you are. But for large global companies where supply is shifting all the time, verifying it is pretty impossible at this point. And it's challenging because the EU law requires that. So that's where listening to that discussion about how they're actually going to enforce and frame that law, I think they have a long way to go, because what's being asked for is almost not possible. On the other hand, what we're seeing companies doing in the world of cotton with the UFLPA and Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, similar concept. How do you show where things come from? And they didn't come from Xinjiang, China, is really tracing individual POs, saying, I have a PO for this much palm oil, this much soy, tell me where it came from, show me documentation, right? Can a supplier lie at tier 4 about the documentation for a certain thing? Yes, they can, right? Is that a foolproof system? It's not. It's really hard to have a foolproof system for that upstream, unless you're tagging every cow's ear, which you're not for most things that aren't cows. So it's there's still a long way to go there. And I think all that can be asked of companies is to do the proper diligence, right? Assess, map, collect the documentation, and have it available, and rely on these systems as they come into place. Even certified, as we know, certified material across the board is rife with issues of non-certified material getting into that supply chain, right? They're not foolproof systems, but we use what's there, and we improve systems, especially as more momentum gets behind these approaches, and legislation pushes technology and pushes companies to do more.
Any other thoughts there, team? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that is something that we constantly hear, just anecdotally, just kind of sharing from when we're working with our customers, that it is, it's traceability is one of those things that's just really hard to put a handle on, and just understanding exactly what you mean by traceability, because we know that that can mean different things depending on the industry, depending on the scope of what your company is looking for, or for what those regulations mean as well. So I think the first step is just to take a first step, and know that it may not necessarily be everything, but just like anything else that's really seems unmanageable, just find one part to begin, and then from there move on and do the next part. So just begin is really where it needs to go. We have another question here as well. Do the panelists have thoughts on supplier provided data versus leveraging geospatial data to monitor deforestation? I think this is a really great one.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in again. I think they're both very important. Right, a supplier, you want to have faith in what they're telling you being accurate, but you also want to be able to verify. So I think geospatial data is really important. I mean, it's certainly, we've used it when looking at Brazil and looked at, well, we looked at it after there have been some pretty striking, well-researched articles that came out over the last year, I think in the Washington Post and Bloomberg, about deforestation in Brazil related to the beef industry. I have, I look at the major suppliers out of Brazil and what they're saying around traceability, and what their goals are. And when we look at the reality that Brazil is constantly hitting the highest rates of deforestation ever, well, you have to look a little more closely at, those big beef packers who are saying they have 100% traceability to their suppliers. Well, the the reality is they have that traceability to tier 1 suppliers and little visibility beyond that. So, we took a look to see where beef packing houses are throughout Brazil, looking at geospatial images for those regions and just seeing the rate of deforestation over the last couple decades. There are beef packing houses within the Amazon, and certainly deforestation is linked to beef production there. So you hear from suppliers or potential suppliers that everything is good and they're sustainable and 100% traceability, but the reality, at least in Brazil, doesn't seem to line up with what's being said. So yeah, I mean, when I visited Nicaragua, we had our supplier survey in front of those suppliers. We sent it out like the week before I went. So when I got there, I was able to speak with them about it. And they were, those suppliers had the greatest response rate of all our suppliers because I was there in person with them. I was able to see, it's not a use of geospatial, but the pairing of both supplier statements and surveying along with, in person or a third-party verifiable information went a long way for us. I'll say more broadly, I think there's a great deal more that geospatial data can be used for. We're looking at it for beef production, but related to GHG emissions. So that technology is not yet commercially available, but those companies that focus in that space are developing the capacity to measure methane from concentrated emission sources like oil and gas wells and feedlots. So that's something that we're looking to do is we have greater kind of interventions into our beef supply chain and helping to deploy feed supplements that have been found to drastically reduce methane emissions, and doing so at scale. We want to be able to measure the changes and be able to verify any claims that we may end up making in the future.
I'll just build real quick on what Jonathan's offering, is that the geospatial data can help you address multiple aims that you're working towards with your supply chain. So in addition to deforestation, there are other ways to other information and layers that you can add. And the connection point we're seeing growing these days is this broader nature view. So looking at biodiversity more holistically and looking at land degradation and other indicators about the different realms around nature, and being able to monitor that kind of at that more holistic level using like a geospatial approach can really help accelerate managing some of those different issues.
Yeah, I know the question is versus supplier provided data versus geospatial. It's not really either or. You know, they triangulate, and on the other hand, if you're very far from the sources, you don't even know what you'd be monitoring geospatially, right? So that's not a tool that could work for you if you're first have to understand where things come from. I think geospatial monitoring works amazingly well when you know exactly who you buy from and it doesn't change, right? And you have outlines of their plantations. You can monitor those plantations. You said, I caught you, you deforested in the last 2 months. That's ideal scenario, right? But most companies don't buy directly from those locations, and the supply changes all the time. So to have a database of polygons in your own supply chain that you can monitor in an ongoing way is just not reality for most companies. So then you're back to kind of what Jonathan was saying, looking at regions, right? Okay, I source from this, probably source from this part of Brazil. What's going on there? What's happened there? What should I worry about there? Rather than kind of a real time, hey, supplier, you know, I got to cut off that contract because you deforested, right? I think we're still a long way from that, from the level of traceability to be able to do that. So in the meantime, you're kind of into a mapping process, a supplier declaration process, and hopefully getting suppliers to actually point out where actually things specifically come from, so that the geospatial data can support, right? So I think they're really intermingled. And just to answer that last question there, will companies need to rely on a specific provider? I've found that both in the US and Europe, the legislation really never points to specific providers of things. It says, here's what you got to do. And then lets companies figure it out because they want that competition of the technologies. And then they'll check up on you when they want to and see if they think what you did was good enough. So.
Absolutely. I think having both is really what's important. And so, you know, you want to have that as one of your arrows in your quiver. So just make sure to have a full quiver for everything. We are at time. Thank you everyone for being part of this discussion today. Thank you to my panelists, Jonathan, Cheryl, and Jamie. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I do want to point out that the next and final session that we have is how procurement professionals can lead sustainability. And in that one, we'll be discussing the growing role of procurement and sustainability initiatives and how you can use supplier sustainability data in buying decisions to drive your improvements. Again, thank you so much for being here today. Hopefully you've registered for our next session as well. And we look forward to seeing you either live or in one of these again sometime soon. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.